I'll raise för you, Wolfie. Please be seated.
Yes, Madame Favreau.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me speak for a few moments about the evacuation of the wounded from Popović. We have set out our arguments in paragraphs 343 to 349 of our brief. Let me just say that this evacuation had been requested by Dutch BAT. Robert Franken said so on the 16th of October 2006, transcript pages 2515, by MSF, and that on the 16th of July, General Nicolai was eagerly awaiting the authorization to take to Popović the convoy that was to evacuate the wounded. Exhibit P1191 and P2978. When the notifications bearing the name of General Milicic were sent, the evacuation of the wounded was the only possible solution. It is obvious that neither Dutch BAT nor MSF were going to stay in Popović and that the wounded had to be evacuated. I doubt very much that the prosecutor, who elsewhere alleged that there were no medical supplies in Popović, seriously suggested that these notifications should not have been sent and that the evacuation of the wounded was not necessary. Let us now address the issue of the transmission of messages mentioned by the prosecutor on the 2nd of September. P1237. The defense does not challenge that General Milicic could have transmitted the message, and it is possible that this message was about the evacuation. However, the conversation in which General Milicic was mentioned does not allow any conclusion as to the knowledge General Milicic may have had of the very subject of the request made, and even less as to General Milicic's intention. The only conclusion this conversation allows is that General Milicic was not authorized to take a decision. What could General Milicic do faced with such a situation? Was he supposed to turn down and refuse the message to be transmitted, and therefore to block this evacuation that was requested by all international organizations in BIH, included the UNPROFOR? We do not think that document P260, which was transmitted at 17 hours on 18th of July, has any link with the conversation that took place at 21 hours on 17th of July, P1237. It is very unlikely. It is improbable that Colonel Jankovic would have waited 24 hours to make his request. Furthermore, Exhibit P260 refers to the 18th of July events, and these events could not have been the topic of a conversation that was taking place the day before. Let me return briefly to the issue of humanitarian aid. The prosecution case that the Serbian authorities demanded reciprocity and made the conditional of humanitarian aid to Muslims conditional on aid being provided to the Serbs stands in contradiction to the case that the restrictions aimed at creating an unbearable situation for the Muslim population. If reciprocity had been the condition set by the Serbs, the restrictions that were in any way limited cannot be ascribed to the intent of creating unbearable conditions for the Muslims, but rather to the will to make sure that the Serbs had the best possible conditions. However, this case, even though it is to some extent favorable to the defense, is incorrect. Reciprocity was requested one single time, because what is alleged by the prosecutor in paragraph 226, footnote 513, namely that fuel was authorized for the enclaves only if Serbs were to receive some as well. This allegation is incorrect. Further to Exhibit P2689, the fuel for Srebrenica was authorized unconditionally. When the Serb authorities asked humanitarian aid supply for the Serbs to allow the passage of a convoy, the convoy was not destined for the Muslim population. It was destined to supply the UNPROFOR. This happened on the 1st of July 1995, P2554. In our closing brief, we mentioned problems linked with humanitarian aid in June 1995. Problems that were not at all linked to Serb policy. In June 1995, the UNHCR had foreseen 1,250 tons of humanitarian aid for Banja Luka. Exhibit P4145, page 19, shows that nothing reached its destination. And when I say nothing arrived, nothing at all arrived. Faced with such a situation, once and only once did the Serb authorities request reciprocity, which did not in any way jeopardize supplies destined for the Muslim populations. The humanitarian aid convoys and the UNPROFOR convoys were different in every respect. They were also had to undergo different procedures. This is an essential difference because, contrary to what the prosecutor alleged, the coordination organ did give authorizations for humanitarian convoys. This was mentioned in paragraphs 322 to 342 of our brief. Furthermore, the prosecutor has original main staff documents regarding the convoys, which were incidentally stipulated between the prosecution and the Militage defense. This is Exhibit 5D 1447. All these documents have to do with UNPROFOR convoys. If the procedure had been the same, we would have found among these documents related to humanitarian convoys. But I'm not interested in the confusion between humanitarian convoys and UNPROFOR convoys, which pervades the entire prosecutor's brief. But I'm interested in the confusion between the part of the brief regarding the alleged contribution of General Militage to restrictions to the convoys, paragraph 1679 to 1687, and the general part regarding restrictions to humanitarian aid, paragraphs 215 to 250. In paragraph 219 of their brief, the prosecution described the procedure by which authorizations were given to UNPROFOR convoys. The prosecutor acknowledged that General Militage did not take any decisions. The prosecution further acknowledged that General Militage did not draft any notifications. Indeed, the prosecutor acknowledged that the part played by General Militage was to sign a notification and to send them to subordinate units. Although the prosecutor acknowledged that General Militage did not play any part in taking decisions or in determining the contents of notifications, in paragraph 1679 of their brief, despite the evidence in its totality and in contradiction to their own case as set out in paragraph 219, the prosecutor alleged that General Militage refused to grant passage for the convoys with school supplies, would have limited MSF personnel rotation, and would have specified a request for control. In the same paragraph, the prosecutor alleged that General Miletic was involved in sending notifications on the 6th and the 10th of March 1995, referring to unsigned copies of the notifications, P2522 and P2531. The original and signed versions of the notifications have been admitted into evidence, 5D 1311 and 5D 1312. These notifications were not signed by General Miletic. They were signed by Colonel Panjic, who was not even a subordinate of General Miletic. There is no evidence that General Miletic ever saw the documents. Furthermore, the other notifications referred to by the prosecutor in paragraph 1679 are all unsigned copies. Taking into account the fact that there are many notifications bearing the name but not the signature of General Miletic, which emerges from the stipulations between the defense and the prosecutor, 5D 1447, there is no conclusive evidence that the notification, the signed version of which is not available, were ever signed by General Miletic.
Il faut dire aussi.
One has also to say that the sending of the notifications did not contribute at all in the questions of humanitarian aid, for as much as they had to do. The notifications did not have as a goal to prevent the passage of the convoys, but to allow it. No convoy could pass the control point or checkpoint without having been announced by a notification of the main staff. Even when a notification contained the information concerning an unauthorized convoy, it had no impact on the passage of the convoy, because until the notification authorizing convoy to pass reached the checkpoint, the convoy could not go through, could not pass. And announcing the convoys and the control of the same was quite licit and conform to the Geneva Conventions.
Voyons un peu d'ailleurs.
Let us see what General Miletic knew about the humanitarian aid. When General Milovanovic was not at the main staff, the name of General Miletic was on the notification. He signed a certain number of them, but he never took the authority of the general for substantial matters linked to humanitarian aid. This authority of General Milovanovic were taken over by other officers of the main staff, including by General Mladic.
Le général Miletic.
General Miletic did not take part in the meetings of UNPROFOR. He did not take part to the meetings of the international organizations. He was not a superior to Colonel Georgic, who was in charge of the convoys. He did not give him any instructions. General Miletic was not a member of the inner circle of the main staff and took no decisions. Besides, in the section of his brief concerning the Serbian policies of the political and military authorities concerning humanitarian aid, paragraph 246 to 250, the prosecutor did not mention General Miletic, thereby acknowledging implicitly that General Miletic had no role in the devising of this policy.
Le général Miletic.
General Miletic had no role in the follow-up of the convoys, because the reports concerning them were not sent to his administration, but to the intelligence administration, P260. Precisely in this context, one should interpret notification of the 29th of June 1995, P2551, mentioned by the prosecution at paragraph 1683. Although this notification contains a note concerning specific instructions sent to Momin Nikolic, there is no evidence that General Miletic knew about this instruction, which had certainly been, knew anything about the content of this instruction, which certainly had to be sent to Momin Nikolic directly through from the intelligence sector and security sector. Also, the reports concerning the convoys were directly sent and personally sent to General Mladic, as was the case for the 23rd of June 1995, P2496. General Miletic knew nothing in particular about questions concerning humanitarian aid. What General Miletic knew was that since the notification had to be sent in order to enable the passage of a convoy, no officer would have refused to sign and send such a notification. This notification question shows no personal intention of General Miletic.
En effet, le seul document
Indeed, the only document and the only evidence which can inform us of the position of General Miletic about the passage of convoys is the intercepted convention of the 24th of July 1995, P1327, concerning the problems linked to the passage of a convoy to Garage Day, described also in a document from the Drina Corps, P3035. This conversation shows that General Miletic, when he knew about the problems concerning the passage of a convoy, considered that such problems had to be solved. Let us now speak about Directive number 7. This is the center of the case against General Miletic. We agree with the prosecution that during the drafting of this directive, the complete method was used. Within the framework of this complete method, which had been decided by the commander and the commander only, General Miletic was able only to do his own part of the work. We agree with the prosecution that the different elements of the directive were transmitted to General Miletic by the different sectors of the main staff, and that General Miletic then compiled them to make a single document. While acknowledging that Directive number 7 was drafted by an application of the complete method, the prosecution implicitly acknowledged that General Miletic was not the author of the contents of this directive. The only fact of having taken part in the drafting of Directive number 7 does not mean that General Mladic contributed to the joint criminal enterprise, General Miletic, as alleged in the indictment. The prosecutor could speak of a contribution of General Miletic if he had proved that General Miletic had drafted the offending parts of the directive, or that he had accepted them and had adhered to them. Yet the prosecution did not prove any such thing. The prosecutor acknowledged in paragraph 1680 that General Miletic had seen the document of the Drina Corps in which the commander of the Drina Corps proposed some solutions for the elimination of the enclaves. Beyond the fact that this proposal shows very well that the Corps commanders were making proposals to the commander of the Army of the Republika Srpska, this tells us nothing about the position of General Miletic. He saw it, but there is no evidence that he was in agreement with it or that this proposal had been included in the draft directive drafted by General Miletic. Besides, the prosecution alleges that General Miletic compiled the part of the directive concerning the tasks of the units on the basis of the proposals of organs charged with the different army corps. Paragraph 1673. General Miletic compiled the whole project of the directive on the basis of the elements obtained from the different organs, as the prosecutor acknowledges in paragraph 141. On the basis of the evidence in the case file, it is impossible to say who supplied him with the proposal for the part concerning the tasks of the units. The text drafted by General Miletic was the draft of the directive. The text of this draft is not known, and there is no evidence which enables us to conclude that this draft contained the offending passages of Directive number 7. In
Paragraphe 142.
his briefing at paragraph 142, prosecution admits that President Karadzic could amend the draft directive drafted by General Miletic. This also means that President Karadzic could add some passages, and in the offending passages. Contrarily-wise to what the prosecutor alleges, the directive was not issued under the name of General Miletic. Also, it was not sent to the corps as a document from the general, who at the time was Colonel Miletic, but as a document from President and Supreme Command Radovan Karadzic. The prosecutor's allegation, according to which General Miletic should have known every word contained in the directive without having signed his name on the text, is absurd. The name of General Miletic on the text of this directive means he prepared the draft directive, and certainly doesn't mean that he approved the final text of the directive. The final text belonged to President Karadzic, who had the single and exclusive authority to approve it, which he did by putting his signature on it. General Miletic could have known and should have known every word of the draft directive who was sent to President Karadzic for signing. But as for the final text of the directive, General Miletic could not know it before it was transmitted to him. Yet, there is no evidence in the case file to show that General Miletic would have seen the final text of Directive 7 before he started working on the draft Directive 7/1. In his closing argument on the 2nd of September 2009, the prosecution stated that there was no evidence which would have confirmed that General Miletic might have not taken part in the finalization of Directive 7. Contrarily-wise in this business, there is no evidence that General Miletic would have taken part in the finalization of the directive. General Simic indeed spoke about the finalization, but it was the finalization of the draft, because all the process which General Simic has described takes place before the draft was sent for signature on the 19th of November 2008, page 28511. This statement made by General Simic helps in no way the prosecution in its efforts to show that General Miletic would have taken part in the finalization of the directive after the changes President Karadzic may have brought to it. The onus of proving this remains with the prosecution, and the prosecution has to prove each and every one of his allegations beyond any reasonable doubt. The defense has not got the same onus. It suffices for it to adduce evidence showing that another possibility is reasonable. evidence, of course, which is circumstantial, as they may be, show, in fact, that General Miletic did not take part in the finalization of the final text of Directive 7. The defense agrees with the prosecution that General Miletic should have told General Milanovic if he had seen the offending parts of the text of the directive. We consider that there exists at least a reasonable possibility that General Miletic did so. The directive bears the date of the 8th of March 1995, while it was sent to the Corps only on the 17th March 1995. The agenda of President Karadzic, Exhibit 5D 1322, shows that on the eve of the transmission of the directive to the Corps, General Milanovic had a meeting with President Karadzic. The only reasonable explanation of this meeting, which lasted 4 hours and which took place on the 16th of March 1995, would have been about a discussion on Directive number 7. The prosecution stated also that General Miletic could have done something else and could have acted contrarily if he had not been in agreement with the directive. We entirely agree. General Miletic could have refused to send the directive to the Corps. The prosecution will certainly tell you that there is no evidence that General Miletic refused to transmit Directive 7 to the Corps. And in a certain sense, he is right, but only partially. Because if there is no evidence that General Miletic refused to transmit the directive to the Corps, we do have the proof that he did not further it or forward it. P5 5D 971 confirms this. The only thing which is proven in this case concerning the final version of Directive 7 is that it was transmitted to the subordinate units by General Milanovic. Since General Miletic did not transmit Directive 7 to the Corps, there are only two options concerning the knowledge he may have had of the final text. Either General Milanovic transmitted the final version of Directive 7 to the Corps as soon as he was back from the meeting with President Karadzic without telling General Miletic, or General Miletic was unwilling to forward it. The prosecution adduced no evidence which might have supported his case according to which General Miletic adhered to the final version of Directive 7. The evidence, circumstantial evidence, lead to the conclusion of the opposite, which is General Miletic was not in agreement with the directive. This is a possible and reasonable conclusion which explains the meeting which General Milanovic had with President Karadzic on the 16th of March 1995, and the belated or delayed transmission of the directive practically 10 days after the date indicated on the text of the directive, and the fact that General Miletic did not forward it. General Miletic did take part in the drafting of Directive 7/1. and his role in the drafting of Directive 7.1. It was identical to his role in the drafting of Directive 7. Such participation cannot be interpreted as his adhering to the text of Directive number 7, since the text of Directive 7/1 does not contain the offending passages contained in Directive 7. The very existence of Directive 7/1 asks us the question of why this directive was drafted. Before Directive 7, only Directive 6 came from President Karadzic. This is Exhibit P3919. Following Directive 6, the main staff did not draft Directive 6.1. On the contrary, when President Karic considered that the text of Directive 6 had to be changed, he did so by a document which he signed himself, 5D 964. Directive number 7 indicated the task to be performed by the corps, and it was transmitted to the corps. There is no military reason for the main staff to embark in the drafting of Directive 7/1 immediately after the transmission of Directive 7. This was not necessary for the performance of Operation Sprecher, since General Milanovic had sent the order to the Corps for this operation, 5D 972. Operation Sagietto, planned at the main staff, did not require either to dispatch Directive 7/1 at the end of March 1995, since all the details of this operation were sent to the Corps only towards the end of the month of April, P4202. One of the possible explanations, and a perfectly reasonable explanation for emitting Directive 7.1, was precisely that this directive, that is Directive 1, was made to replace Directive 7. The prosecution quotes a sentence from General Milanovic, although he does not consider this sentence as credible. He completely ignored his explanation about Directive 7.7. Directive 7. It is indicative, though, that precisely General Milanovic, who denied any part in the drafting of these two directives and who proclaimed that he had no knowledge of their existence, declared that General Mladic was risking to be arraigned in front of a martial court because he had omitted certain parts of Directive 7 in the documents which he subsequently drafted. There is no doubt that General Milanovic was more specifically speaking of Directive 7. The part taken by General Miletić in the drafting of Directive 7 and 7.1 cannot be interpreted as his adhering to the offending parts of Directive 7. The existence of his name on Directive 7 and 7.1 to the utmost allows to conclude that when Directive 7.1 was drafted, he had cognizance of the final text of Directive 7. Such knowledge does not mean that he adhered to the offending parts of Directive 7. Subsequent events show that General Miletić had no significant part in the events concerning Srebrenica and Zepa, that he was absent during the military operation at Srebrenica, that he had no sufficient knowledge concerning the events on the ground, and that his acts and behavior do not allow an inference about his intention to contribute to forced transfer. Prosecution stated that Directive 7 concerned the inception of the attack. Yet, during the hearing of the 10th of December 2008, page 24490, 289 to 290, the prosecution declared that the army of the Republika Srpska did not change its behavior after Directive number 7, and that this behavior was the same as at the beginning of the war. We agree with the prosecution that no change can be noted in the behavior of the army of the Republika Srpska after the issuance of Directive number 7, But in that case, it is difficult to understand how Directive 7 represented the beginning of the attack. Besides, there is no evidence that a systematic attack or generalized attack against the population, civil population, would have started in March 95. Be as that it is, General Milanovic was present at the general headquarters of the main staff for a long period following the issuance of Directive 7. No evidence allows to conclude that General Miletic knew about the incidents linked to the bombing or snipers or other activities around Srebrenica and Jepa, inasmuch as such activities are established. The only bombing which is reported at the main staff was that which took place on the 25th of May 1995. Yet General Milanovic was there. Exhibit 3D5D1161. It is absurd to establish a link between the training program of snipers and a possible use in an illegal way of snipers. The body was one in charge of operational matters and training, was in charge of organizing and planning training. This organ could not determine the content of the training, since every training required specific knowledge, and since the content of this training was precisely determined by specialized organs for different subjects. Anyway, the program mentioned by the prosecutor was not meant for an illegal use of snipers, but precisely for the correct use of snipers. Snipers are not a forbidden weapon, and the existence of a training program has no specific meaning. Finally, it remains unknown when the program was drafted and when it was transmitted to the Corps. The program which we have in the case file was transmitted to the 5th Corps, which in 1995 didn't even exist. The prosecutor alleges that the acts and decisions of General Miletic were crucial to defeat militarily the Muslim forces and to transfer the population of Srebrenica and Jepa. I have already said that General Miletic was not even in a position to make decisions, but I shall not belabor this point. Rather, I would like to underscore the confusion created between acts which are destined to defeat militarily Muslim forces and those which were destined to forcibly transfer the population. Military defeat of the enemy, which for the army of the Republika Srpska were the Muslim forces, is a natural and legitimate objective for any army in an armed conflict. On the other hand, the forcible transfer of population is a forbidden act and is a crime. In order to prove the forcible transfer, and in particular the intention of the accused, the prosecutor should have made a clear distinction between the military objectives and the criminal objectives. Indeed, when an act may reasonably be interpreted as being destined or meant to achieve an illegal military objective, the prosecutor cannot attribute to him a criminal intention. This intention can only be inferred from facts which cannot reasonably be explained by a legitimate military objective and which allow no other conclusion than what was meant for the transfer of the Muslim population. It is difficult in a conflict like this one, indeed, to distinguish between the facts connected with a military attack and the facts connected with criminal acts. Yet, The prosecutor has the duty to do so. In the present case, the prosecutor stated several times that the separation of the enclaves was a legitimate military goal. In particular, in the preliminary statement of 21st August 2006, page 398. He cannot now, for the purpose of his own closing argument, make a confusion between this legitimate part of the attack and a criminal objective. We agree with the prosecutor when he states that the intent will determine the legitimacy of an act, and that a legitimate act accomplished with a criminal intent may become criminal. Yet, if the intention confers a criminal intent character to an act which without such intent would have been legitimate, this act will only be criminal in respect to those who acted with a criminal intention, but will be legitimate for those who did not act with such intention. For General Miletic, the prosecutor did not prove that he acted with a criminal intention. According to the allegations of the prosecution, the contribution of General Miletic would have been criminal activities which he would have followed, and obtaining information from General Mladic and President Karadzic. Prosecutor alleged that precisely this information would have enabled General Mladic and President Karadzic to make the decisions and to apply the policy of forcible transfer. First of all, the prosecution did not prove that President Karadzic took decisions on the basis of the reports sent by General Miletic. The prosecutor did not even indicate which would have been the information which would contribute to the decisions of President Karadzic. We have indicated in paragraph 492 of our brief the sources from which President Karadzic obtained the information. There are many of them. The decisions concerning Srebrenica and Žepa were certainly not made on the basis of the reports sent by General Miletic, daily reports. As for General Mladic, he had no need of the reports of General Miletic. He received directly information from the commanders of the corps, which were subordinated to him. The evidence in this case show that the civilian authorities informed President Karadzic. This evidence shows that a delegation of Skelani was to meet President Karadzic after the action at Jeleni Jada in order to find a solution to put an end to this action, which the civilian authorities considered as incomplete. This is Exhibit 5D 1374. The evidence in this case also showed that President Karadzic sometimes had much more information than the main staff. Intercept of 16 July 1995 shows that precisely President Karadzic informed the main staff of the opening of the Zvornik corridor. In the daily reports of the main staff, you have a description of the military situation on the ground in all the territory of the Republika Srpska. Their goal was no other than to inform President Karadzic and the commanders of the corps of this military situation, and no other interpretation may reasonably be attributed to such reports. Neither the follow-up of the military situation, which General Mladic could not keep track of, except on the basis of the reports of General Miletic, nor the transmission of this information could reasonably be interpreted as contributing to the criminal enterprise as alleged. None of these acts is illicit. These acts constitute the regular and daily duties of General Miletic. On the 2nd of September 2009, the prosecutor started his final speech by the duty for officers to accomplish their duty. The duty of the officer in charge of operational matters is to draft and transmit reports. These acts are precisely what the General did. These acts are the acts of any officer in charge of operational matters, and what any officer would have done. No officer in charge of operational matters would have done otherwise. No criminal intention may be inferred from the report sent by General Miletic, because for these reports there is another logical and reasonable explanation, which, by the way, is the only reasonable explanation about it. General Miletic was doing his job. This job was legal, licit, regular, and necessary for the furthering of legitimate and justified military activities. He did so without any criminal intent.
We'll continue tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.
Monsieur le Président, j'aurais besoin peut-être d'une quinzaine de minutes de plus.
Mr. President, I would probably need 15 minutes extra.
Okay, that's a problem, Judge Kwan. Okay. Pas de problème.
All rise, veuillez vous lever.